No one expected a 10-year-old to stop the court that morning. But when Susan Gray stood up and said, "Free my father, and I'll heal your deaf son," even the judge forgot to breathe. Before we begin this story, take a second and think. What would you give to save someone you love? Tell us where you're watching from, and hold on till the end. Because what happened that day in Alabama City made even the coldest hearts believe again. But before we continue, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments which part of the story hit you the hardest. I believe this story found you today for a reason. Now, let's get back to the story. The Alabama City courthouse had seen its share of trials. But nothing like this. IT was one of those muggy southern mornings when the air itself seemed nervous. Reporters filled every aisle, their cameras buzzing like hornets. Spectators whispered in disbelief, fanning themselves with notepads, while a tired bailiff tried to quiet the noise. At the center of it all sat Judge Anthony Peters, silver-haired, iron-eyed, and famous across the state for his rulings that showed mercy to no one. Beside him, the seal of Alabama glinted under the flickering courtroom light, and in front of him, the defendant's chair sat empty. Adams Gray, the man everyone had already condemned, hadn't even been brought in yet. His lawyer, Henry Scott, looked like he hadn't slept in days. 2 years of appeals, 2 years of dead ends, and now, a desperate hearing no one believed would matter. Across the aisle, Ethan Stewart, the state's golden prosecutor, sat smirking with the calm of a man who'd already written tomorrow's headline. The courtroom air grew thicker when the back doors opened. The guard stepped aside, and instead of a lawyer or witness walked in a little girl in a blue dress, 10 years old, barefoot, holding a faded photo of her father in an orange jumpsuit. Reporters turned their cameras. The room went silent, except for the steady ticking of the courtroom clock. Judge Peters frowned. "Young lady, who are you?" She took a step forward, voice trembling but clear. "My name's Susan Gray, sir. You put my daddy in prison." A nervous whisper rolled through the courtroom. Peters blinked, unsettled. Susan clutched her photo tighter. Her lips quivered, but she didn't cry. "If you let him go," she said softly, every word like a prayer, "I'll make your son hear again." The silence that followed was so deep it felt like the world itself stopped breathing. Reporters froze mid-sentence. The bailiff dropped his pen. Even Judge Peters, the man who'd sentenced dozens without blinking, suddenly forgot how to speak. By nightfall, the story had already escaped the courthouse. TV anchors argued whether the girl was an angel or a fraud. Talk shows replayed her trembling voice. And somewhere in a federal prison cell just outside Alabama City, Adams Gray bowed his head, whispering his daughter's name through tears. What no one knew then was that her words weren't just faith. They were a promise that would change every life in that courtroom forever. By nightfall, the story had already escaped the courthouse. TV anchors argued whether the girl was an angel or a fraud. Talk shows replayed her trembling voice. And somewhere in a federal prison cell just outside Alabama City, Adams Gray bowed his head, whispering his daughter's name through tears. What no one knew then was that her words weren't just faith. They were a promise that would change every life in that courtroom forever. 2 years earlier, the name Adams Gray meant nothing outside of construction sites and time cards. He was a foreman at Chateau Monagle, a sprawling estate that rose like a castle on Monagle Way in Shoal Creek. He worked 12-hour days, kept his boots clean, and never once imagined stepping into a courtroom, until the night the vault was found empty. $2.5 million in jewels. Gone. And every piece of evidence somehow pointed to him. Security footage, fingerprints, a witness statement. All of it wrapped up neatly. Too neatly. Henry Scott, his overworked public defender, tried to fight, but the prosecution came armed with money, power, and influence. Judge Anthony Peters presided. Steady, distant, unmoved. The verdict came down like thunder. Guilty. Susan was only 8 when she watched her father taken away in chains. Her mother, already weak from illness, died months later. The little girl moved in with her grandmother, who led the choir at a small Baptist church on the south side. Life didn't get easier, but Susan didn't bend. She prayed for everyone, for her grandma's aching back, for the sick boy down the street who couldn't walk. When he stood one morning without his crutches, people started whispering. Meanwhile, behind the gates of his mansion, Judge Peter sat at his piano, his son Eric resting beside him, deaf quiet, locked in silence since the fever took his hearing. Peters played songs the boy could no longer hear, pretending it was enough. If you ever carry the kind of pain that never makes headlines, a pain that sits quietly in your chest, then you'll understand Susan's courage. Don't just watch your story, stay with it. Stay because some stories remind us what being human really means. The rain came slow that night, whispering against the tall windows of the Peters estate. Inside his study, Judge Anthony Peters sat surrounded by silence and half-read files, legal drafts, appeals, the usual ghost of a man who carried too many secrets. The fire burned low, throwing thin orange light across his face as he adjusted his glasses and tried to drown himself in paperwork. Then came the sound, a soft scrape across the polished wood floor, a faint rustle beneath the door. He looked up. A single white envelope had been pushed through the crack, sliding toward his shoes like it carried a message that didn't want to be seen. He hesitated before picking it up. The handwriting was uneven, shaky, the kind of writing that came from trembling hands. He tore it open and read slowly, each word heavier than the last. Eric's hearing loss was an accident. Someone made sure he got sick. The man who knows the truth is the same one who framed Adams Gray. It was signed Dr. Raymond Keller. Peter's hand froze midair. Keller. The name hit like a stone in his chest. Keller had once been a private physician at Chateau Monagle, the same estate tied to Adams Gray's conviction. His mind raced. Was this a cruel hoax? Or a confession long buried beneath money and power? He stood, pacing. If this letter was real, it meant reopening wounds that could end his career. Or worse, his family's name. In the end, fear won. He folded the paper and locked it in his desk drawer, burying truth beneath polished mahogany. Across town, Henry Scott sat in the dim visiting room of the federal prison. Adams Gray leaned forward, voice low and steady. "My little girl," he said, "thinks she can fix everything, even broken hearts." Henry didn't know why, but in that moment, something deep inside him wanted to believe she could. By the end of the week, Susan Gray wasn't just a little girl anymore. She was a headline. Reporters swarmed her grandmother's porch, flashing cameras through the cracked screen door. Neighbors whispered when she passed, their eyes torn between awe and suspicion. The church down the street called her a miracle child. Online, people called her fraud. News vans parked outside the small wooden house where she and her grandmother lived. Pastors from nearby towns begged her to speak at their Sunday services, while talk show hosts offered her fame she never asked for. But every time someone asked her how she did it, Susan gave the same answer: "I just talked to God." She didn't want miracles. She wanted her father home. Flashbacks drifted through her thoughts like old hymns. She remembered when her cousin Marcus, told he'd never walk again, stood up after she prayed by his bedside. She remembered little Calvin from Sunday school, blind since birth, reaching out toward the sunlight and whispering, "It's warm." Her grandmother warned her softly, "Baby, the gift's a blessing, but a burden too." At school, whispers followed her down the hall. "That's her, the girl who talks to God." Someone had to sit beside her at lunch. Others moved away like she carried something too holy to touch. Meanwhile, far across town, Judge Anthony Peters parked his car behind a row of oaks outside a small brick church. He slipped in quietly, sitting in the last pew, hiding beneath his hat. The choir song filled the room like honey, sweet, slow, heavy with truth. When the music faded, he saw her. Susan knelt in silent prayer, her small hands clasped tight, face glowing in the soft morning light. Something inside the judge, something locked away for years, cracked open. For the first time in a long time, he felt the ache of his own soul. The courthouse hadn't been that full in years. People lined the marble steps before sunrise, clutching coffee cups and camera phones. Alabama City buzzed with one question. Could the girl really do it? Inside, security tried to keep order, but the tension hummed like an unstruck bell. Judge Anthony Peters entered the courtroom quietly, his face unreadable. To the public, this was an emergency retrial. But to him, it felt like standing between faith and reason, with no safe ground in sight. Prosecutor Ethan Stewart leaned across his table, voice sharp as glass. Your Honor, I plan to crush this circus before it begins. His smirk spread like oil across water. Across the aisle, Henry Scott shuffled through files that had stopped feeling useful months ago. Then a clerk approached, dropping a plain brown envelope on his desk. No return address. No name. Inside were 6 photographs, grainy stills from Chateau Monaco security feed. But one image was different, a timestamp edited, a face blurred out. His pulse quickened. Someone had tampered with the footage. Henry looked up at Adams Gray, who only stared at the ceiling, lips moving in silent prayer. Judge Peters called for recess, his gavel echoing like thunder. When the crowd cleared, he found himself standing in the quiet hallway, staring at the girl in the blue dress. Susan smiled at him, calm as sunrise. Sir, she said softly, faith don't need proof, it needs a heart. He wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. That night, back home on Monaco Way, Peters found his son Eric, sitting up in bed, tears streaking his cheeks. Daddy, the boy whispered, I saw her again, the girl from the courthouse. She was talking, and I could almost hear her. If this story is touching something in you, that quiet place where right and wrong wrestle, don't look away. Keep walking with Susan. Some moments change everything. The morning after the hearing, the city woke restless. Headlines screamed miracle child or master manipulator, while talk radio stations argued over faith and fraud. But in a quiet diner off Broad Street, Henry Scott sat hunched over a laptop beside an investigative journalist named Maria James. Steam curled from untouched coffee mugs as the two stared at the screen. Maria's fingers flew over the keyboard, tracing data lines that led somewhere they weren't supposed to go. After hours of digging through encrypted servers, she stopped. There, she whispered. That security footage, it wasn't uploaded from the courthouse servers. It was transferred from a private account, registered to Ethan Stewart. Henry's breath caught. The prosecutor? Maria nodded. And there's more. The owner of Chateau Monaco filed an insurance claim on those jewels 3 weeks before the so-called robbery. He got paid out in full millions. Henry leaned back, stunned. Adams didn't steal anything. He was the fall guy. Across town, in his study, Judge Peters reread the files from Adams Gray's case. Every photo, every transcript, every hollow testimony now felt poisoned. He should have closed the drawer and walked away. But the child's words wouldn't stop echoing. Faith don't need proof. It needs a heart. He reopened the case file, fully aware that one wrong move could end his career. That night, as thunder cracked over Shoal Creek, the police discovered Dr. Raymond Keller's car abandoned near the highway. He'd been missing for days. Inside his phone was one final voicemail, his voice weak, trembling. They'll come for me next. Tell the judge the child is right. Peters listened to the recording twice, the rain beating harder against his windows. Something bigger, darker, had been hiding behind the law all along. And now, it was staring straight back at him. By the time the retrial began, Alabama City felt like the center of the world. Reporters camped outside the courthouse steps, their lights burning through the morning fog. Inside, every pew was filled, pastors clutching their Bibles, skeptics with folded arms, mothers holding children close. Even the old bailiff looked uneasy, as if something sacred was about to happen. Judge Anthony Peters took his seat, his gavel heavy in his hand. The weight of truth and fear pressed against his chest. To his left, Ethan Stewart stood rigid, jaw clenched. Across the aisle, Henry Scott whispered a final prayer with Adams Gray, who wore the same tired orange uniform but carried a calmer heart than anyone in the room. When Adams took the stand, his voice was low but steady. "If my little girl believes God don't make mistakes," he said, glancing at Susan, "then I believe her too." A murmur rolled through the courtroom. Some smiled, others wept. Then Susan rose. She walked to the center aisle, her blue dress brushing the floor, her hands clasped tight around a small wooden cross. "Your Honor," she said softly, "can I see your son?" The judge's eyes widened. Silence swept the room like a tide. After a long pause, Peters nodded. The doors opened. Little Eric Peters stepped inside, shy and pale, holding his mother's hand. Susan knelt before him, meeting his eyes with quiet certainty. She placed her small palms over his ears and whispered, "Hear the truth." For a moment, nothing. Not a breath, not a sound. Then Eric gasped, his fingers trembling. "Mom," he said, voice breaking through years of silence. "Why is everyone crying?" The courtroom erupted. Gasps, sobs, shouts, prayers. Even Ethan Stewart bowed his head. Faith had just spoken louder than proof. Night fell over Alabama City, but sleep never reached the courthouse. Inside a dimly lit office, Henry Scott stared at the glowing screen of his laptop. Every file, every line of code, every frame of the security footage was there, and buried deep within it, proof of manipulation. Timestamps were altered, sections spliced, faces blurred. The signature embedded in the data belonged to Ethan Stewart's legal firm. Before dawn, Henry rushed through the rain to Judge Peters' home, the evidence clutched against his chest like scripture. When the door opened, Peters saw what he already knew in his heart. The truth had finally come for him. By morning, the courtroom was once again filled to the walls. The air was heavy with waiting. Peters sat behind the bench, the papers in his hands trembling slightly. Across the aisle, Ethan Stewart looked pale, cornered by the storm of his own making. "This court," Peters began, his voice catching, "has reviewed the new evidence submitted by the defense. It is clear that the footage used to convict Adams Gray was falsified." He paused, eyes glistening. "The individual responsible has fled the country." A silence fell so deep it felt holy. Then Peters' voice broke softly. "This court overturns the conviction of Adams Gray. You are a free man." Gasps filled the room, followed by tears, applause, and prayers whispered through shaking lips. Adams buried his face in his hands before collapsing into his daughter's arms. Judge Peters stood, his robe heavy with emotion. He stepped down from the bench, crossed the courtroom, and knelt beside Susan. "You gave me back my son," he whispered, tears slipping free. "I give you back your father." Susan smiled, voice small and steady. "God just wanted us to meet halfway." The crowd rose to its feet. Justice, long buried, had found its way home. Weeks later, Alabama City had begun to breathe again. The courthouse steps were quiet, the crowds gone, but the story lingered, like the echo of a hymn you couldn't forget. In a park near Shoal Creek, under the soft gold of an early spring sun, Susan Gray and Eric Peters chased one another through the grass. Their laughter, bright, real, alive, drifted to the air as Eric called out, "Susan, slower. I can't hear you when you run that fast." She giggled, turning back toward him, her braids whipping in the wind. Someone sitting nearby caught it all on their phone. The laughter, the sunlight, the innocence that had once stopped a nation. They uploaded it that evening with a simple caption. She healed his ears. He healed her heart. By morning, it had crossed 2 million views. Comments poured in from every state, Alabama, Texas, New York, California. People wrote about faith, about fathers and daughters, about miracles that didn't fit in headlines. Adams Gray reopened a small construction business downtown. He worked with steady hands and a lighter heart, never knowing that the quiet donations keeping it afloat came from Judge Anthony Peters himself. Peters had resigned from the bench soon after the trial. He spent his mornings walking with his son and his evenings playing piano again. This time, not to fill the silence, but to celebrate it. Ethan Stewart, stripped of his license and reputation, vanished from public view, another shadow washed away by truth. As the sun set over Shoal Creek, Susan stood on her porch, the wind tugging gently at her dress. She looked toward the glowing horizon and whispered, "Sometimes faith sounds like silence until someone finally listens." If this story reminded you that hope still lives in ordinary hearts, don't walk away quietly. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from and which part of the story hit you the hardest. We've got more powerful, emotional stories coming your way, and trust me, you don't want to miss them. Stay with stories like this one, the kind that make us believe again.